On the 29th of June 2003, emergency services in Manchester, England received a call from a shaken 16-year-old boy explaining that his friend, who was just 14, had been stabbed by a hooded man. Nothing could have prepared police for the shocking series of events leading up to the crime that is so insane that many have since questioned if it was all a fictional tale. But I assure you, the story I'm about to tell is 100% true. Let's investigate. If you enjoy internet mysteries and generally disturbing content, feel free to subscribe and turn on notifications for more content like this. If you're interested in supporting the channel, you can become a Ko-fi member or a channel member to gain access to uncut videos and other perks, or you can leave me a tip by clicking the thanks under this video. Thanks to anyone who considers this. This video will cover topics that some might find triggering, including attempted murder, abuse, and catfishing. You can become a Ko-fi member to watch an uncut and ad-free version of this video which features extra details that were unsuitable for this cut. If when you're watching this video you get distracted by the background noise of the wind outside or your cat meowing in another room, perhaps you need some new earbuds, and I'd recommend Raycon, the sponsor of today's video. Raycon's everyday earbuds just got even better. Their upgraded model offers all the features of the previous models, but now also has active noise cancellation, ergonomic design, and even multi-point connectivity that allows you to pair with two devices at once. They're available in a variety of vibrant new colours to complement any skin tone, but of course I went with black to match 90% of my outfits. These earbuds are so comfortable. The ones I was using before would always fall out of my ears while walking, or if I knocked them slightly, but these ones feel really secure when I'm moving around cleaning the house, or when I'm curled up on the sofa editing a video. They also have a 32-hour battery life, and the quick charge function means you can charge them for 10 minutes for 90 minutes of use. Now is the best time to try Raycon's everyday earbuds. They even offer a 40-day happiness guarantee, and if you click the link in the description or go to buyraycon.com/internet investigator, you'll get 15% off your Raycon purchase plus free shipping. In the late 1990s, in a time before Facebook and Twitter, and before many people even owned mobile phones to text, instant messaging programs were becoming a popular way to communicate. In 1999, Microsoft launched MSN Messenger as a rival to AOL's AIM service. It was a little late to the party, considering ICQ had been around for almost 3 years at that point, though it eventually became the most used instant messaging service in the world. It started out pretty simple, with plain text messaging and a basic contact list, but its integration with Hotmail and the initial ability to chat with an AIM account made it one of the more appealing options. As more features were added, such as smileys, audio clips, and webcam video chat, it continued to grow in popularity. In 2002, a 16-year-old boy named Mark was gifted a computer by his parents to help with his schoolwork, and of course, the novelty of the internet meant he spent much of his time online, exploring and chatting with new people. He joined an MSN chat room for local teens in Manchester and eventually got talking to a girl his age named Rachel West. At the time, Mark was in college and worked part-time at a restaurant. He wasn't the most academic person, but he did reasonably well in school, and his teachers never had any problems with him. He was well-mannered and respectful, and never got into any trouble. He was close with his family and had some friends in school, though had always struggled a bit when talking to girls. He found this a lot easier when he was behind a screen though, and would talk to various different girls in the chat room, sometimes moving on to webcam where their interactions would become a bit more spicy, so to speak. For the most part, it seems that Mark saw these interactions as nothing more than casual fun, but when Rachel joined the chat room, something was different about her, and they instantly hit it off. Mark soon decided to go on webcam with Rachel, but she didn't have a webcam, and regardless, she seemed wary of video calling with him, implying she'd had a bad experience in the past. Mark was a little disappointed, but he liked the photo he'd seen of her. She was slim, with long blonde hair, and he thought she was beautiful. He was surprised she was even talking to him in the first place, so for now, just photos were enough for him. Rachel soon introduced Mark to her younger stepbrother John, asking him to make friends with John, who didn't have much of a social life and was bullied in school. Unlike Mark, who came from a functional middle-class family, Rachel and John's family were much less stable. When John was a baby, his father, who was physically and sexually abusive to his mother, abducted him. Of course, he had no recollection of this, and only found out at the age of 4 that his stepfather wasn't his biological father. His stepfather was a drug user and abandoned the family when John was 7 years old. This took a huge toll on his mother, who he often heard crying in the living room. John began self-harming at a young age, depressed due to his home life, and school wasn't much better either. His classmates would make racist and homophobic remarks towards him. Because of his darker skin tone, he assumed his dad must have been Asian, and the kids in school would say he was gay because most of the few friends he did have were girls. Mark hadn't been filled in on many of these details, but was more than happy to befriend John if it impressed Rachel. Although John was 2 years younger, he and Mark had a lot in common and quickly became good friends. Unlike Rachel, John had no qualms video calling with Mark, and they'd spend hours bonding over their interests. Eventually, they even met up in person, and everything went great. Meanwhile, Mark continued to get closer to Rachel. After chatting for a couple of months, he developed strong feelings for her, and he told her he loved her. She reciprocated. Some of their conversations were sexual in nature, and as he had with other girls before, Mark would go on webcam naked as Rachel encouraged him. Despite never meeting in person, because every time they tried, one of them found an excuse not to turn up, he was infatuated with her. He was the happiest he'd been in a long time. Through this novel online world, he'd found a best friend and a girlfriend, but it wasn't long before there would be trouble in paradise. In April 2003, someone named Kevin joined the MSN chat room. Kevin was a self-proclaimed homosexual stalker who would harass Rachel and John, with John even believing that Kevin had started following him home from school. Kevin soon began targeting Mark too, using his relationship with Rachel to his advantage. Kevin would threaten Rachel and tell Mark he had to perform tasks on webcam to prevent his girlfriend getting hurt, and of course Mark obliged, feeling like he had no other option. This incident showed Rachel how much Mark cared about her. He was willing to sacrifice himself and agreed to Kevin's sordid demands to keep her safe. After her initial wariness, she seemed to trust him a lot more now, and finally agreed to meet him in person. So one day, Mark left his home and made the 40-minute bus journey to Altrincham, a town in Greater Manchester. He arrived at the place they'd agreed to meet, but there was no sign of Rachel, and after waiting for hours, she still never showed up. With no way of contacting her while outside, he had no option but to go home. He checked his computer for a message from her, hoping there was a reasonable explanation as to why she didn't turn up, but what he ended up finding was so much worse than he could have imagined. A message from Kevin revealed that he had kidnapped Rachel and described in detail how she had been gang raped and murdered. Presumably terrified of Kevin, Mark never told his parents about this or the police. I guess he assumed they were already aware and were investigating. Either way, all he knew was his girlfriend was dead, and he was devastated. He became more withdrawn and his grades dropped. The only person he could confide in was John, who had lost his sister and grieved with Mark. Sometime after Rachel's death, Lindsey joined the MSN chat room. Mark was still struggling to move on from everything that had happened, but perhaps making new friends would help. He began chatting to Lindsey and soon began to develop feelings for her. The feelings were mutual, with her confessing she was falling in love with him. As they became closer, they would divulge more personal information, and Lindsey eventually told Mark she was a secret agent for MI6. She revealed that she had joined the chat room in the first place to monitor John, who was apparently under government protection. Although Kevin had disappeared since confessing to murdering Rachel, Lindsey believed it was only a matter of time until he would return to harm John. She needed Mark's help to keep John safe and insisted that John cannot find out about any of this. Shocked but excited to have been entrusted with a mission from a literal spy, Mark agreed to do whatever he could to help. Then suddenly, Lindsey disappeared, and Mark received an email explaining that she had been killed, and now it was up to him to protect his friend. Things got even more bizarre when shortly after Lindsey died, Rachel came back from the dead. She told Mark that she had been kidnapped by Kevin, but that he hadn't murdered her, and she'd been in a coma this whole time. Mark's initial delight at his girlfriend's resurrection soon turned to confusion when she told him that while she was in a coma, she'd given birth to his baby. Naturally, Mark was suspicious of her story. They'd never even met. How could he possibly have impregnated her through MSN Messenger after only 3 or 4 months of talking? Was this Kevin impersonating Rachel? Had Rachel just lost her mind after being held captive by Kevin for however long? Before Mark could find out the truth, Rachel disappeared again. Sometime after, a woman named Janet Dobinson joined the chat room. She began talking to Mark, telling him she was a 44-year-old estate agent, married with 2 children. But this was all a cover. She was actually another spy, and not just any spy, a much higher rank than Lindsey. In fact, she claimed she was the 3rd most powerful woman in Britain. It wasn't long before she too started speaking inappropriately with Mark. She was trapped in a loveless marriage and insisted that despite her age, she was still very sexy. She encouraged him to perform various acts on webcam, and he happily obliged. He did whatever she asked of him, and seemingly recognizing his dedication, she eventually revealed that the Secret Service wanted to recruit him. She informed him that he would be taken to London for his initiation. Here's an excerpt of one of their MSN conversations. Janet: when would London be an available option? Mark: it would be easier to go in the day than the middle of the night if that's possible. Well, I have plans for Saturday. I'll cancel them. Janet: no, we can suit your requirements. You will meet the Queen, Prime Minister, Defence Secretary, Head of British Secret Service Protection, many interesting people. Mark: cool, I'm nervous. My mum doesn't like me missing school and stuff. I would need to speak to her just to say I'm okay. Janet: she would be sent photos every day of your progress and 2 phone calls allowed. You will have 15 minutes briefing about how to address the Queen before meeting. It is compulsory for anyone meeting Her Majesty. Mark: okay, well, I'll be polite as I usually am anyway. At this point, if not a while before, you might be thinking this all sounds ridiculously far-fetched. In just a few months on a local MSN chat room, Mark's online girlfriend got murdered by a stalker, then he starts some kind of relationship with a secret agent who also ends up dying under suspicious circumstances. Then Rachel reappears saying she'd given birth to his baby, even though they'd never even met, before disappearing again. Then he gets talking to another secret agent who seduces him and promises to recruit him into the MI6. For most of us in 2024, if we were approached online by someone claiming to be a spy, we'd instantly write it off as a scam or a catfish, but this was 2003. People weren't really aware of catfishing, especially 16-year-old boys who got their first computer less than a year ago. A lot didn't add up with the demise of Rachel, and he was skeptical, but he was good friends with her brother John. They'd even met in person. John had confirmed Rachel's death, so the only plausible explanation was that her resurrection and the story of the coma and the baby was a cruel trolling attempt by Kevin. As an outsider hearing this story, I would assume that Lindsey was a catfish who had heard about what had happened and used it to groom Mark. Same for Janet. It's implausible that either her or Lindsey were actually spies, let alone both of them. Given that they both had inappropriate, intimate online relationships with Mark, in which he'd perform various acts on webcam, it seems likely that he was targeted by one or more pedophiles who took advantage of him in a vulnerable situation. When Janet first began talking to Mark, he wasn't 100% convinced, but as time went on, after he'd been persuaded to go on webcam, after Janet had told him he would be recruited into the Secret Service and would be paid millions of pounds, as well as receiving favours, he was taken in by it all and started to actually believe it. If you ignore the fact that the story itself is far-fetched, Janet actually made it sound quite plausible. She went into detail on exactly how things would progress, and she had an answer for everything. What really cemented his belief in her, though, was that she always seemed to know where he was and what he was doing throughout the day. This made sense when she explained that there were spies everywhere in Mark's town. Bus drivers, shop assistants, postmen, they were all reporting back to Janet. Before Mark could be taken to London for his initiation, he had to prove himself. Janet told him that he'd have to act as a bodyguard for an important person named James Bell, who was the focus of Janet's investigation and was worth billions of pounds to the country. James Bell turned out to be none other than Mark's friend John. Janet told him to take John out of school one day for his safety and to tell the school it was for a dentist appointment, promising he'd be paid $300,000 if he completed this task. Like Lindsey had said, John wasn't to be made aware of what was happening, so Mark would have to come up with excuses. For example, telling John he took him out of school just so they could hang out and spend the day together. So far, Mark's tasks had seemed quite reasonable to him, considering the overall goal of protecting John, but his next would make a lot less sense. Janet told him that they needed to make it look like John was gay, and so Mark would have to have intimate contact with him. Mark wasn't exactly keen on the idea, but, convinced it was a necessary part of his mission, he reluctantly agreed. After completing this task, Mark was under the impression that he had passed the test and proven himself, and now he could go to London to meet the Queen and the Prime Minister, that he'd begin receiving the hundreds of thousands of pounds he'd been promised, and that he'd be able to have physical contact with Janet, but he'd soon learn that this mission was not yet over. Janet told Mark that he had to complete one final task before he could be accepted into MI6. Before he could begin any new missions as an official secret agent, he had to tie up the loose ends of the last. Here's an excerpt of one of their chats. Janet, could you kill someone close to you? You might be tested on that later on. Mark, I dunno. I probably would, but I want to know why. I haven't really thought about it. Janet, well, think please. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. Mark, yeah, I could. There's my answer. Janet wasn't asking a hypothetical question here. She wanted Mark to kill John. When Mark learned this, he was initially hesitant. When he said he would kill someone, he thought Janet meant in the future. When she said someone close to him, he thought she meant a future partner who turned out to be a double agent or something, not his best friend. Not now. Understanding Mark's apprehension, Janet divulged some information that she was sure would change his mind. Firstly, she had access to John's emails and had discovered that he had been diagnosed with an inoperable brain tumour, meaning he likely didn't have much life left. Secondly, she had learned that due to his terminal diagnosis and the continuous bullying he experienced at school, he was planning to commit a school shooting. With this information, Janet reasoned with Mark that killing John was for the greater good, and that since he would die soon anyway, Mark wasn't really taking a life. He was only saving the lives of John's classmates that he was planning to kill. The final nail in the coffin for Mark would occur a couple of days later, when he received a message from John, quote, "I got a letter today from my doc. When I went in a few weeks ago because I was depressed and shit, I got a brain thingy tumour, but it's big." Janet had been right, at least about the tumour, and considering she'd been right about everything else, including Mark's whereabouts and actions since they began communicating, he now had no reason to distrust her claim that John was planning a shooting. Mark accepted his mission. On the 28th of June 2003, Janet detailed exactly what Mark must do the following day. He asked, "You want me to kill him? That's what you're asking me. And just leave him to die? What should I say to him? Stand there a minute while I stab you." Perhaps there was a little hope left in him that this was all just a joke. Or maybe now he'd made it clear he was willing to do it, that'd be enough to prove his dedication. Maybe Janet wouldn't actually insist he went through with it. But she was serious. She told him to take him to a quiet place, wear gloves, use a knife, not a pocket knife, quote, "It has to be big to stab him and make him bleed to death." She told him he could buy a knife at the shop Boots. He could tell John he was buying it for his mum, and that he should tell John he loves him as he stabs him. Then call an ambulance, but not straight away, only when it would be too late for them to save John. Janet would pose as a detective superintendent and meet Mark at the police station to ensure everything went smoothly from there. On the off chance something cropped up that meant the mission had to be aborted, Janet told Mark, 6969 abort code, okay? Must stop straight away with 6969. The next day, Mark and John met in Altrincham and spent most of the day wandering, looking around the shops, and as planned, Mark went to Boots to buy the knife, even asking John to pick it for him. Mark waited and listened, hoping to hear 6969 blare out from a speaker somewhere, or for a shop assistant or dog walker to whisper it to him. They never did, and he knew what had to be done. He took John to an alleyway and after 25 minutes pulled out the knife and said, "I love you, bro," as he plunged the knife into his best friend. Holding him, Mark stabbed him again, causing him to fall to the ground. Mark pulled him up to his feet and stabbed him a third time. John screamed, "Call an ambulance, I'm dying." Mark begged him to be quiet so people didn't hear him, and John replied, "You've killed me." "Don't say that. Don't let that be the last thing you are saying," begged Mark. Around 20 minutes later, Mark finally called an ambulance, believing there would be nothing they could do to save John by the time they got there. Miraculously, John was still alive when paramedics arrived at the scene. He was taken to hospital, requiring immediate surgery to remove his gallbladder and stop the bleeding from his kidney and liver, and despite almost dying twice on the operating table, he survived. While John was recovering in the hospital, police were trying to piece together what had happened to him. Mark had told them that a man in a hoodie had come out of nowhere and stabbed John, and although they initially believed him, doubts would soon start creeping in. Altrincham just wasn't the type of place where people got randomly stabbed. Surely there had to be more to it. They checked the CCTV in the area, and luckily there had been a camera pointing towards the alleyway. It hadn't captured the stabbing itself, but it did show Mark and John entering the alleyway alone, and no one else followed or came in after them. They knew then that it must have been Mark. He was confronted with the footage and confessed to the stabbing, but police were still baffled. Mark had never been in any trouble before. There didn't appear to be a motive, and although he did it, he seemed to be genuinely disturbed at the whole situation. Janet didn't show up at the police station as she had promised, but believing there was still hope, Mark refused to reveal the events leading up to the stabbing, stating that he had heard voices telling him to kill John. A month later, his hope finally ran out, and he told them everything. Police charged Mark with attempted murder and began searching for Janet. They seized both Mark and John's computers and read through nearly 60,000 messages on the chat room. After discovering that Mark had virtual, intimate contact with Janet and others he'd interacted with in the chat room, they believed this may have all been orchestrated by a ring of pedophiles. Out of all the people that Mark had spoken with, they narrowed down the list of people who may have been involved in this to just 6, including Janet, Lindsey, Kevin, and Rachel. While analysing all these interactions, they noticed something interesting. Although each of these people had their own different writing styles, personalities, and mannerisms, they had one unusual thing in common. They all misspelled the word maybe as M-Y-B-Y-E. Could it be that Janet, Lindsey, Kevin, and Rachel were all one person? Surprisingly, there was someone else who also spelled maybe in this way. John. Data collected from John's computer revealed that all of these individual MSN accounts had logged in on his computer, leading police to wonder if a member of his family had been behind all these characters, and of course the plot to murder him. To determine who it could have been, they set out to identify who was at home when Janet had been active on MSN. The last account that signed in on the computer before the stabbing was Janet, and the only person home at the time was John. This had all been set up by John. A Vanity Fair article stated, quote, "The beautiful Rachel West, whom Mark had loved, wooed, and honestly mourned, was John, as was Kevin, who revelled in the bloody details of her gang murder. Lindsey East, who had briefly enchanted him and then disappeared without a word of goodbye, was John. Janet Dobinson, who had watched him on a webcam and who had promised him a lifetime of wealth and glamour, was John. The ice cream vendors and shop assistants engaged in ceaseless surveillance of Mark, all John. The world he had known was John, written, produced, and directed by John." John was arrested in hospital and immediately confessed to everything. Police determined from the analysis of his computer that he had created the Manchester Teens MSN chat room where Mark had first met all of these different people. More shockingly, they found that John had created a total of 193 separate online identities, some of which were him pretending to be real people, and the rest were all characters he'd invented, like Janet and Rachel. It wasn't until the trial that Mark learned that John had been behind everything. All he could say was, "I've been a fool." John explained how he had created the Rachel and Kevin storyline just to see how gullible Mark was. The end goal was always to use the character of Janet to plot his own murder. But why? According to a Channel 4 documentary, Kill Me If You Can, all this had started out as a game for John and developed into an unstoppable, all-consuming fantasy, which he couldn't give up. It's implied that John never actually wanted to die, that although he'd gotten carried away with the fantasy, he planned to end it right before Mark stabbed him. Hence, through Janet, he'd given him the code 6969 to abort the mission. But by the end, he was in so deep that even in the face of his own death, he couldn't bring himself to unravel the fantasy. Alternatively, Vanity Fair implies that regardless of whatever reason John started all of this in the first place, he ended up falling in love with Mark, and that's why it all became so elaborate. He was desperate to stay in contact with Mark, whether that was as himself or as Rachel, Lindsey, or Janet. Describing just how convincing each persona was, the article stated, "Threads of plots, no matter how complicated or absurd, were never dropped. A character's most improbable revelations would, inevitably, be confirmed by another. The female creations came across, police decided, as archetypes of femininity, and not simply to a 16-year-old mind. It is instructive, for example, to analyse the dialogue of the character John called Janet Dobinson, number 3 in the hierarchy of the British Secret Service, as she informs correspondents, on whom John clearly lavished special effort. Being middle-aged, she is not with teenage talk. Dobinson admonishes Mark in the chat room, and she requests communication in more adult language. Each style of conversation was totally different. I really believed it," marvels Sally Hogg, the police analyst. "That was the stumbling point for me. At no point could I find he made a mistake." John was careful to find an excuse for a certain character to disappear so a new one could enter the online chat. And sometimes it would be a week or a few weeks before that character came back, always without a hitch, Hogg says. The continuity and his memory were phenomenal. The article provides some insight into John's mind before, during, and after this fiasco, painting the picture of a troubled boy from a broken home who never felt like he belonged anywhere, and who didn't believe anyone would be interested in being friends with just him. Quote, "For all his facility at invention, John wanted for himself no identity at all. That is what lies at the heart of this story. His email addresses contain no hint of his real name. They are proud, existential boasts stuffed with lies. Living it large, lad, at hotmail.com. When John began interacting with Mark, he felt a feeling of emotional intimacy that he'd never experienced before. Simultaneously, he felt isolated throughout this time. He had found a new best friend, but their friendship was based on deception. He had no one to talk to about what had become the biggest part of his life. He had struggled with some level of depression for most of his life, and the stress and guilt of continuing this elaborate story, not to mention the feelings he had developed for John, inevitably began to take a toll. Quote, "Bear in mind this is a love story. That's why you wanted to commit suicide," says Goldberg, John's lawyer. "An unrequited love story." But it wasn't just the virtual Mark whom John loved. The two boys were beginning to meet in person. John saw his friends surrounded by admiring girls. A new feeling took hold. "Wanting my life to end," was how John described it. If he were dead, he told his therapist much later, then nothing more could happen to him. He knew he was addicted, and not just to the internet. If the narrative of the Vanity Fair article is accurate, it's safe to say that this wasn't some cruel, heartless game for John. He wasn't just stringing Mark along for the hell of it. My theory is that he probably didn't set out to find some random gullible idiot for the sole purpose of convincing them to murder him. I doubt he even planned to die at the start of all this. He created these characters because he was lonely and didn't think anyone would want to be friends with the real him. He started chatting to Mark, and when he introduced himself as Rachel's stepbrother and realised that Mark actually seemed interested in the real him, he started developing feelings for him. It seems pretty obvious to me that these feelings were romantic. He was in an online relationship with Mark. even though it was through a character he'd created, and through another character, he convinced Mark to have intimate contact with him, not to mention all the times he had Mark expose himself on webcam to various different characters. If this was all just a game for John, I don't think all those things would be necessary. He knew he couldn't keep Rachel's character going forever, while Mark was actively trying to meet up with his girlfriend that didn't even exist. But once he killed her off, he worried that Mark would lose interest in him, so he had to create more characters and more storylines that directly involved him, ensuring there was always a reason for Mark to stay in close contact. The plot kept escalating and eventually got way out of hand. John knew there was no turning back. He was now in a situation where the best friend he'd ever had was only his best friend because of all the lies he'd told, and if Mark ever found out, which was inevitable at some point, he'd surely never want to speak to him again. John knew there was no way to keep Mark in his life forever, and he was at a point where he didn't really think life was worth living without him. He told his probation officer that he felt trapped in the virtual world with no way out. Quote, "My life was on the internet. I didn't like it. I couldn't undo it. It was all fake." I think that's when he decided he wanted to die, and while it's pretty messed up to convince his best friend to murder him, the last thing he wanted to hear was Mark telling him he loved him. Through Janet, he'd told Mark the 6969 code just in case he changed his mind at the last minute. I don't think John ever intended for Mark to get into trouble for his murder. He didn't tell the police that Mark had stabbed him until they already knew it was him from the CCTV. As for Mark, the most important question that came up during the trial was, did he genuinely believe all this? His lawyer is adamant that he did, describing John as cunning, devious and intelligent, and Mark as gullible and naive. Some who were involved in the trial believed that Mark had been totally brainwashed, taken in by the excitement and the novelty, and of course the promise of incomprehensible amounts of money and favours. It's almost undoubtable that Mark had no idea that all these people he'd interacted with were actually John. And why would he want to stab his best friend if he suspected it was all a farce? There doesn't seem to be any reason to believe Mark was just some cold-blooded killer who was willing to kill John for nothing. However, the prosecutor argued that if Mark was truly convinced he was acting on the orders of a high-ranking secret agent, he would have told police that as soon as he was arrested. Even John had some doubts that Mark believed the farce right until the end, telling his therapist, quote, "Mark must have known at some point that these characters were not real." But he didn't know at which point Mark realised that something was off. At the end of the trial, Mark was convicted of attempted murder, and John became the first person in British history to be convicted of inciting his own murder. After spending 8 months in prison on remand, Mark was sentenced to a 2-year supervision order, prohibiting him from using the internet unsupervised and from entering any chat rooms at all. John spent no time in prison and was given a 3-year supervision order with the same terms as Mark's. Both boys appeared extremely relieved at the verdict, and it was determined they'd have a high chance of rehabilitation. They are banned from ever meeting each other again. John made a full recovery from his injuries and was able to get psychological help, which he really needed a long time ago. After the incident, he excelled in school and was described as a star pupil, predicted to get A's in his GCSEs and go to university. Some sources report that he later settled down with a girlfriend, whereas others state he had a boyfriend. The Vanity Fair article, published 3 years after the stabbing, said that John misses Mark terribly, and the mere thought of him reduces him to tears. Mark and John are not the boys' real names. The British press was prohibited from using their real names due to the sensitive nature of the case. I did manage to find one article that named John, but this was published right after the stabbing, when the culprit was thought to be a random thug, before it was revealed that John had planned everything. None of the articles I came across gave Mark's real name, and I couldn't find any information on what happened to him after the trial. In the Channel 4 documentary, John's lawyer described this as a case of folie à deux, when two people set off madness in each other. Quote, "Either of these young men could go 1,000 years and never meet somebody who would set off this kind of behaviour in the way the other did." I'd be interested to hear your thoughts and theories in the comments, plus any suggestions you might have for a future video. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing. Huge thank you to my Ko-fi members and channel members whose names are on screen now. I really appreciate your support. Remember to click the link in the description or go to buyraycon.com/internet investigator to get 15% off your Raycon purchase plus free shipping. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time in a new video.